A disclosure letter is useful evidence after completion of what was disclosed. And so the buyer can't say they didn't know various things, because you have a disclosure letter telling the buyer what they knew against the warranties. A disclosure letter is as important as the sale and purchase agreement, and they should be looked at together. But usually in a deal, the disclosure letter comes much, much later on in the deal, and sometimes is looked at in quite a hurry. The disclosure letter and the sale and purchase agreement they're two sides of the same coin. The sale and purchase agreement effectively protects the buyer, and the disclosure letter in general protects the seller. They're two sides of the same coin. They're a compromise. If I'm buying your company and I ask for a litigation warranty and you refuse to give me one, we're a long way apart. The deal's not going to progress on that basis. But if I ask you for a warranty and you give me one, knowing you can disclose against it, we get closer. And if I know that I can take an indemnity against your disclosure, we get closer still, of understanding, the buyer understanding the company and the seller protecting themselves. Disclosure is good. It gives a buyer it gives a seller adequate protection, and it gives a seller adequate protection and gives the buyer knowledge of the company they're buying. It needs to be explained to some clients why disclosure is good. If a client hasn't done a deal before, sometimes they're very reticent about telling a buyer bad things about their own company. They feel that's not the way to negotiate. They feel, probably not consciously, but selling the company is rather like selling a second-hand car in the street to a stranger for cash. If I'm selling my car to a stranger in the street for cash, I'd meet him, I'd say this is a wonderful car, I keep it in the garage all week, I just use it once to go 1.5 miles to the supermarket to buy the weekly food. It's very well looked after, only one owner, and so on. And then I let him drive it around the block with me. I keep my fingers crossed it's not going to break down. It comes back, it's absolutely fine. The buyer likes it. They pays me several £1,000s, exchange the logbook, and I move fast in that direction. He drives off in that direction. And if he breaks down, well, that's too bad. I know that we all know selling a company is not like that, but we have to explain to clients why. And the reason is that as soon as the buyer owns the company, they've taken warranties, and the warranties will last for 1 year or 2 years. They've got 1 or 2 years to find out everything that's wrong with the company. They actually own it. And if it hasn't been a proper disclosure against the warranty, the seller will be asked for some money back. Therefore, we have to impress upon our clients, if we're acting on the sell side, that disclosure is good. We need to explain the warranties to them line by line, and that will concentrate their minds. If they realise what liabilities they're taking on without disclosure, they'll think of all sorts of other things they ought to be disclosing. So we start off, as I mentioned in another video, the parties owe each other no duty of care. The seller is not obliged to make any disclosures to the buyer at all. Silence is not in any way a breach of anything. You don't have to say anything. There may be something which you feel is very bad with your company, but the buyer's not going to find out about it within 18 months to 2 years. Therefore, you might decide not to disclose it for a commercial point of view. You're not doing anything wrong by doing that. Now, the buyer is obviously very aware of this. Therefore, the buyer will try and mitigate this caveat emptor rule, the let the buyer beware rule, by taking very, very firm warranties. What the buyer is going to try and do is to make the seller legally liable for their representations if they prove to be false, by taking warranties for potential risks and indemnities for specific liabilities. That's what the buyer wants to do. But the seller then needs to limit their liabilities to those warranties, which the buyer is insisting on, by disclosing against them. we've seen in previous videos that prior knowledge will negative a warranty to the extent of that disclosure of prior knowledge. What it does, if the buyer knows something, if the seller tells the buyer something by way of disclosure, that removes the buyer's entitlement to sue on the basis that the buyer has been given the facts, and effectively the seller has invited the buyer to reconsider the position in the light of this new information, which may or may not change the price. Therefore, the buyer has not been misled. Because of this, the buyer must understand the extent of the disclosures. What do they actually mean? An insufficient analysis of the disclosures will lead to avoidable liabilities. The buyer must understand what is being disclosed and read it very carefully. Now, the buyer can then try and